Hi everyone, my name is Cassidy Patterson, and I am going to be discussing my assigned work-oriented method, which is critical incident technique. So first, before we get too in detail, we need to discuss what critical incident technique actually is. So a critical incident technique is described by Flanagan as a set of procedures for collecting direct observations of human behavior in such a way as to facilitate their potential usefulness in solving practical problems. So in other words, we use this method to observe people's behaviors so we can understand what to do and also what not to do in certain situations. This method was developed in World War II for several Air Force projects. When Flanagan first reported this method, he said there are 3 pieces of information that are required to conduct a proper CIT, or critical incident technique. First, what led up to the behavior in question. Second, the employee's behavior. And third, the consequence of that particular behavior. Since this method is based solely on observation and recounting events, this method does not cost anything unless you're planning on using some sort of new technology to either record or review observations. And then you also have to consider the cost of, once you're recording, to store and maintain those as well, but still a relatively inexpensive cost altogether. So next we'll discuss the purpose and application. So why do we conduct a critical incident technique? So the purpose of a critical incident technique are to observe notable occurrences or incidents and draw conclusions based on the behaviors presented in the observation. You can have individuals recount critical events either before, during, or after the event has actually taken place. This is especially helpful in workplace setting because you can look at specific events, see the exact behaviors that were acted out, and see the direct consequences of those actions. You can use this method to differentiate behaviors that are either effective or ineffective in a particular job the individual is in. This can be helpful for companies so that they can see what behaviors provide satisfactory results. The handbook also describes this method as being flexible and adaptive because this method basically allows you to focus on any event or any behavior that you see fit. So this type of method is extremely useful when you're looking at accident prevention, training, performance appraisals, and also even selection as well. So now that we understand a basic overview of what this method actually consists of, we can go on to the exact steps and procedures now that it takes to conduct a critical incident technique. So with this, there are 5 steps that you need to take in order to conduct a full CIT, which were created by Flanagan also in 1954. The first of these steps described by Flanagan is to specify the objectives of the overall task. So there's usually multiple objectives, and these are usually determined by whoever has the authority over the task at hand. The second step in conducting a critical incident technique is that you need to come up with a plan on how you will go about performing the critical incident technique. The first questions you need to ask yourself before conducting is, who will you be observing? Obviously, this is extremely important because you need to have some sort of, of course, before an objective in mind, what are you looking for? And so once you decide what you're looking for, it will be easier to understand who you need to observe to be able to see a specific behavior and a specific consequence. You'll also need to consider who will be the actual observer, whether that is somebody internally or an external consultant. You will also need to find out if there were any prior critical incident techniques that were performed that are relevant to the one you're about to conduct. So you're able to be familiar with steps made in the past and what those behaviors look like, what those outcomes, and so you can shift gears if needed to make sure that you are, getting the information that you're looking for out of this. So now that you have decided what event and the exact behavior you're going to be analyzing and looking at, and the means of how you're going to go about getting that information, you'll then start step 3 and collect the data. The person conducting the critical incident technique can ask questions about what was happening in the event and questions about specific behaviors that were exhibited. Once you've gathered and recorded information about the incident, you can then start step 4, which is to begin the analyzation of the data. This is a step where you can summarize, explain, and apply your findings. And then once you are done with that step, the 5th and final step is to make the interpretations about the data that you have found and collected. These last steps are the ones that show you exactly what is desirable versus undesirable in terms of the behaviors presented. And this can be specific to, the organization or the workplace or the specific job that you're looking at. I mean, it illustrates how to change or continue this behavior in the future, whether that finding is desirable or undesirable. So now that we understand the steps and procedures that we go through in order to conduct a proper critical incident technique, let me now give you a really great example. As stated previously, there are 3 pieces of information that need to be presented to have an effective critical incident technique, which are a statement of what led up to the behaviors or the problem, the employee behavior, and then the consequence of that behavior. A great example of an effective critical incident technique comes from the Brannick, Levine, and Morgeson readings. The example they give is actually table 2.13. And that example is as follows. An engine fire started in a car at a gasoline pump in a gas station. The police officer was driving by on patrol, noticed the fire, stopped, and quickly extinguished the fire with the chemical extinguisher from her patrol car. Her quick action prevented a major fire or explosion. The reason this is such a great example is because it contains all 3 pieces of the information that is needed. First, it describes the context of event. It describes how the engine fire started in a car at a gasoline pump in the gas station. Then it continues and explains the behaviors exhibited by the person. So then it goes on to say the police officer was driving by on patrol. She noticed the fire, stopped, and quickly extinguished the fire with the chemical extinguisher from her patrol car. It lists every single action and behavior that came from the person in the example. Then third, it also states the exact consequence of these said behaviors. So the very last sentence is her quick action prevented a major fire or explosion. So obviously in this case, this would be a desirable behavior. This would be something you'd go back, look at these behaviors, and say to people, you need to follow this step, this step, this step, and this step in order to make sure that this is the outcome. So although this method can be very useful in many situations, there's still some things to consider before applying this technique to your own situation or your own organization. One issue with this method is recalling the situation at hand. If we do not have someone reporting an incident, it's up to the person within the situation itself to recall what exactly happened that led up to that event. And then sometimes, because if they're the only one there, this can lead to some biases or miscommunications about the event. It can also be difficult for somebody to take themselves out of the situation enough to be able to fully explain the context of the situation as well. So obviously this can lead to less than ideal analysis of the event or the incident. Next, we will discuss advantages of critical incident technique. So when conducting a critical incident technique, there are many advantages, obviously, to using this method. One major advantage is that it is relatively inexpensive to conduct, which I've already touched on a little bit in a previous slide. Obviously, it doesn't cost any money to recall the information about the event or for the event to take place because these are events that happen naturally, but you will still need to consider how you're going to document these findings for future use, but still in the long run, relatively inexpensive. Another advantage would be the usefulness of the findings for performance appraisals and also selection and training. If used correctly, you can use critical incident technique to explain and showcase either desirable or undesirable behaviors that a person has exhibited during the time in the job, and use that information in a performance appraisal, obviously, to either encourage or change the behavior so you can eventually get that desired consequence or outcome. This is also helpful in selection because it gives a lot of rich insight to behaviors that are mandatory for great performance of the job at hand. And of course, it can be used also for training purposes, much like performance appraisals, to show what behaviors the organization is looking for. Although there are definitely advantages to critical incident techniques, there's always going to be some sort of disadvantage to any method that you use. One of the major disadvantages in using this type of technique is just the bias. And this is really whenever you're looking at an event that has already happened. Because what you're going to do is you're going to go to the person that was involved in the event. And sometimes when you are the one involved in the event, you can have a different perspective or a different viewpoint of the context or the behaviors that led up to the consequence that you're looking at. So that can skew the analysis and skew the direction of where you're wanting the example or the event to go. And another disadvantage that you have to think of with this method is that you will need to dedicate a lot of time to documenting the different examples, the different events, and what happened with those examples and events with the job that you're looking for. So if you don't have proper documentation, you're not going to be able to analyze the situation correctly or efficiently, and you're also not going to be able to use any of the method for future uses, which is one of the main advantages of using this method in the first place. So thank you very much for watching my presentation. I hope I have answered any questions about anything critical incident technique related. I hope everybody has a better understanding of this method in general. Thanks so much.